Hello world of YouTube and welcome to another episode of ARC, the show where I get to be an asshole reviewing comics. And we're doing it, we're staying firm, and we're closing this year out with another entry in the Year of the Spider. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. The year-long celebration I started to celebrate my favorite superhero and New York's favorite webhead, Spider-Man. And while I wanted to do a handful of episodes with various Spider people across the Spider-Verse, if I'm going to trim it down to one other non-Peter Parker Spider-Man to tackle, I might as well make it Miguel O'Hara from Spider-Man 2099, the other part of the Across the Spider-Verse story. I was going to at least do a story involving him, by talking about a story that admittedly I didn't want to do initially, but if I'm going to go all in, I'll go all in and talk about The Fall of the Hammer, a story I was already collecting bits for, published in 1994, written by a handful of writers. Peter David, Pat Mills, and Tony Skinner, and John Francis Moore did the writing across the 5 publishing lines with a handful of artists at the helm. And while I wanted to do a more Miguel-centric story, and I'll admit he's not in the story as much as I wanted it to be, because what I've read of the character I enjoy, and I wanted to see him more in a story like this, maybe later on. I mean, it's a nice introduction to the 2099 world. You know, I will say, while it does start in Spider-Man, again, he's not in it all that much. The cooks in the kitchen also kind of jump around a little haphazardly. You know, while I like the idea of world building through these characters, you know, especially involving their relationships and how maybe they're not all on the same page, I like that it explores the ideas of fake gods and, you know, how power can be so corrupted so immensely. You know, the story itself starts by exploring a floating hammer city in the sky. You know, a proverbial Asgard for the modern ages in tribute to Mjolnir in the form of Valhalla. But in its full sustainability comes the resurrection of Asgardian gods. You know, you've got Thor and Heimdall over here. Loki comes in later on, but he also acts as a further proving of a theory that the story cements early on, that the characters aren't who they seem. You know, Balder also comes in, and that affects, you know, the Punisher and his introduction into this whole thing. And while that's great to follow up the arc on Thoron, he ultimately also feels like an interesting concept that sort of gets juggled in the air amidst explorations of environmental hazards and power and the potential corruption of that power in a grander scheme, which is introduced in this Doom comic. You know, again, the Punisher does have a part, and this ultimately builds to a new arc for him, which is, again, further exploring the relationship that Punisher and Spider-Man have. I just kind of wish that if that were the case, these 3 were in the story more. They're just not in the story much. You know, Miguel is in these first couple of issues, and he helps bring the story in, but the minute he comes in contact with this not Frank West, they just fuck off and do their own thing. You know, they make cameos throughout this, but I feel like if you're going to make this guy the hero at the end of the story, he needs to be in this more. You know? Have him hang out with Doom, because that's the most interesting relationship in this story. It's him with the universe at large. He has this perspective that is so removed from everyone else in the story, and it's kind of the most interesting component here. You know, while I'm glad that the X-Men here are all ones that kind of link to the story or act as a good backbone to service the story in their own sort of way. You know, what a couple of the X-Men in this are aware of a character that Miguel also knows that happens to be one of the non-Asgardians in Asgard, and I appreciate that they don't go heavy on anybody else's backstory. They ultimately feel like something that could be more tied to the universe that's already being established at hand. You know, even the Ravager kind of feels like a non-component to the story that Doom sort of actually acts as an accomplice to. I feel like making this a part of this story feels so removed from everything else at play, and it feels not like filler, just sort of tangential in a way that does world building, but not in a way to service the grand story at hand. You know, the actual Fall of the Hammer is resolved so fucking swiftly in the back end of the last comic. It's as anticlimactic as Storm Warnings was, but there was even more of a drag throughout this entire story. I'm of two minds of this. I didn't mind this, but it felt like there were some components that felt so unnecessary to service a message that is important, but similarly to other stories I've talked about, like Revenge of the Sinister Six, could have been set aside and told in their own tangent from the Fall of the Hammer storyline. I don't know. I wish for more of this. I wish that there was more exploring of the Punisher, especially by the end of this. They're introducing components of this amidst that swift finale that feels so important to the character, but feels so immediately rushed in that it kind of just leaves you feeling shocked by it all. There's a moment in this panel, which is like in the last 5 pages, that reveals a huge relationship that was in the balance here that isn't mentioned at all in this fucking story, and that's insane to me. The Punisher is an enigma in this, and I was curious as to who the Punisher was. I don't want to know more about this dickhead, to be honest. He seems like the kind of guy I don't know if I would like. So, I'm upset. The story wasn't great. It wasn't awful, but I wanted more out of this. I still want to get more into Miguel. I like a lot more of what I've read than I haven't. I like the use of the aesthetic, and I think his suit is really cool, and I'm excited to see him explored in across the universe. But what do you think of Spider-Man 2099? Is this a story that you enjoy? Do you like the juggling of themes of fake theism, ecological hazards, and your own personal gripes with your past in tandem with world domination? Let me know in the comments down below. But if you liked this episode of ARC, give it a like. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general notary content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons if you want to join the ranks to get early access to content, exclusive content, or to help drive the community. It's linked in the description. I'm going to go, though. Thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.